Good day. Today is Friday, 25th April 2025. Today, Steve Witkoff is in Moscow. In fact, he's meeting with Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, in the Kremlin, even as I am making this program. Today, also, we received news that another Russian general has been assassinated in Moscow. No, not in Moscow, actually, but in a town close to Moscow. By an improvised explosive device attached to a car. It looks almost certain that this is another assassination arranged by Ukraine's intelligence agencies. Ukraine, of course, has long since effectively admitted that it conducts assassinations on Russian territory. It began doing so, incidentally, before the beginning of the special military operation. As the US media has confirmed, Ukraine began its assassination campaign way back in 2014 when it was first authorized by Ukraine's former president, Petro Poroshenko. Anyway, it looks as if this was this successful assassination by Ukraine of a senior Russian general, not quite as senior as General Kirillov, who was assassinated some months ago. At least he doesn't seem to be quite so senior. But anyway, it is another assassination carried out in Russia, even as Witkoff meets Putin in the Kremlin. Now, I will return to the topic of this assassination later in this program, but I would say that over the last few hours, the British news agency Reuters has published two documents that were apparently circulating earlier this week during the meeting in Paris and the meeting in London. And these two documents, one of which clearly originates from the United States, the document that the Americans brought with them to these two meetings. One document is American. The other document, which is clearly intended as the agreed Ukrainian-European position, is a longer document, rather more complicated, and it sets out what might be construed to be the joint Ukrainian-European position. And this second document, I suspect, has been hammered out and discussed by Starmer, Macron, and Zelensky and their various officials, and almost certainly by the NATO Secretariat and by the European Commission, including Ursula von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas. They've obviously been working on this document for some time. And given that there are one or two overlaps between this Ukrainian-European document and the American document, it's clear that the Americans, on one or 2 points, have attempted to bend a little to satisfy the demands made in the Ukrainian-European document. Now, the American document, I should say, is quite different. In fact, the two documents are completely different. The American document describes itself as a framework document. It provides for a permanent ceasefire, but it sets out what some of the key provisions of the final settlement should be, and it is clearly setting out a mechanism towards achieving a final settlement of the conflict in Ukraine. I will anticipate by saying that though its clear starting point was the Kellogg Plan, it's clear that it has been influenced significantly by the Russian positions, and that presumably is the result of Witkoff's 3 meetings with Putin. It goes significantly further towards addressing Russian concerns than I had realized. And I would quickly add that there's been a fair amount of misrepresentation about this document in the British and European media, which I will turn to later. The European-Ukrainian document is completely different. It might best be described as a proposal for an armistice, rather like the one that Germany agreed to on the 11th of November 1918, the end of the fighting in the First World War, preparatory to the Treaty of Capitulation that Germany was obliged to sign some months later at the conference in Versailles. It is, as I said, a completely different document, as we will see. I'm going to start first with the European document, because I suspect that this has been worked on for much longer than the American document has been. I suspect that various drafts of this document have been circulating for some time. I think the Americans were aware of the discussions. I suspect that the Americans, as I said, have known about this document, and as I said, it's clearly been hammered out as a result of discussions between the Ukrainians and the Europeans, which have been underway probably ever since that disastrous meeting between Zelensky and Trump in the Oval Office at the end of February. And I am going to anticipate and say that I now believe, that the Europeans and the Ukrainians assumed that this was the document that the Americans had come to discuss in Paris and London. That as far as the Ukrainians and the Europeans were aware, the ideas set out in this document were the only ideas that were currently being discussed within Western circles at all. When the American document appeared at the meetings in Paris, it came as a complete shock. As I said, it is completely different. And the vehemence of Zelensky's reaction and the extraordinary reaction that we saw from European governments in the hours afterwards is partly explained by the fact that this American document came as a complete shock. So let's start with the European document and see what it says. And this is the European document that was, as I said, clearly I expect circulating for a long time. And I want to stress again, it's not a peace plan. It is rather an armistice, an end to the military fighting, but one intended to lead to a negotiated outcome, which would be in effect a capitulation by Russia. And this is what it says. The title says official sensitive Russia-Ukraine deal framework ceasefire. The first chapter, the first title is Ceasefire, commit to a full and unconditional ceasefire in the sky, on land and at sea. Now the key word here is unconditional. As we know, the Russians have completely rejected the idea of an unconditional ceasefire. But the Ukrainians, the Europeans insist on one. So an unconditional ceasefire. Next, both sides immediately enter into negotiations on technical implementation with the participation of the United States and European countries. This is in parallel to preparation of the agenda and modalities for a full peace deal. Again, the key there is that the Americans and the Europeans, the Western powers, will participate in the discussion about how to implement the ceasefire. Now notice that these are, of course, Ukraine's allies. So in discussing how the ceasefire is going to work, the Russians would be expected to negotiate with the Ukrainians, but not just with the Ukrainians, but with the Americans and with the Europeans as well. It would be a negotiation which would be lopsided in Ukraine's favor. We're then told that there would then be ceasefire monitoring led by the United States and supported by third countries. We're not told which third countries, but bear in mind the European countries would be involved in sorting out the technical implementation of the ceasefire. So logically and likely it would be then. And then we're told that Russia must unconditionally return all deported and illegally displaced Ukrainian children, exchange of all prisoners of war, the principle of all for all, Russia must release all civilian prisoners. Notice that if we're talking about civilian prisoners or other civilians held by Ukraine, of which incidentally there are some, there is no analogous requirement on Ukraine to release any of them. Then we proceed to the next section of this proposal, which is entitled Security Guarantees for Ukraine. Ukraine receives robust security guarantees, including from the United States, Article 5-like agreement, whilst there is no consensus amongst allies on NATO membership. So the option of Ukraine one day joining NATO remains firmly on the table. In the meantime, until that is achieved, Ukraine will receive the same kind of security guarantees from all the NATO powers, including the United States. In other words, the United States will enter into a kind of alliance with Ukraine and a commitment to defend Ukraine in the event that there is a further Russian attack on Ukraine, or perhaps more accurately, what the Western powers would say was a further Russian attack on Ukraine. That is not the same thing, because as I've said on many occasions, what would actually happen is that there would be what the Ukrainians would say was a breach of the ceasefire by the Russians. It might, in reality, be a breach of the ceasefire arranged by the Ukrainians. But in the context of an agreement like this, the Europeans certainly would support the Ukrainian interpretation of who was breaching the ceasefire. And they would say that in this situation, the United States and the Europeans are obligated to come to Ukraine's defense. Then the next section says no restrictions on the Ukrainian defense forces. So Ukraine can retain its armed forces at any level that it wants, and it can obtain equipment to arm those armed forces from whomever it wishes, including the United States and, of course, the European and other NATO powers. We are then told that the guarantor states will be an ad hoc group of European countries and willing non-European countries. No restrictions on the presence, weapons and operations of friendly foreign forces on the territory of Ukraine. So, Starmer's and Macron's reassurance force can be deployed to Ukraine, and the Russians have no right to object to its presence. And then we're told that Ukraine pursues accession to the EU. Then we come to the question of territory, and we're told the territorial issues will be discussed and resolved after a full and unconditional ceasefire. So there is going to be no discussion about whether the Russians are entitled to remain in the territories that they control or in Crimea, whilst the negotiation until there is a ceasefire. And there's no commitment here, there's no indication here as to what the final status of those territories will be. But bear in mind, by this time, Ukraine will be rearming. It can rearm during the period of the ceasefire. It can have British and French and other NATO forces positioned on its territory during the period of the ceasefire. And in the meantime, of course, also, it will have security guarantees, NATO-type security guarantees provided by the NATO powers, including specifically the United States. We're then told that Ukraine will regain control of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant with United States involvement. Now, I suspect that this was the original proposal. As we will see, this is one proposal that the Americans have taken up. It's a sleight of hand way of transferring the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant to Ukrainian control. And they will also gain control of the Kakhovka Dam. And we're then told that Ukraine enjoys unhindered passage on the Dnieper River and control of the Kinburn Spit. That is also a provision which, as we will see, is carried over into the American proposals. Anyway, that's already lopsided enough. We can see where all this is leading. And then we have a further section which is described as economics. Ukraine and the United States implement economic cooperation minerals agreement. Now, on the topic of that, last week, the Ukrainians and the Americans agreed a memorandum of intent to get this agreement agreed between them. This is apparently almost identical to the memorandum of intent that was supposed to be signed over the course of Zelensky's visit to Washington, the visit which ended in the row in the Oval Office. Now, at the time when we were told that the memorandum of intent had been agreed and signed virtually, whatever that means, the Ukrainians said that there would still need to be significant discussions about its contents, but they were talking about a potential agreement being reached by the 26th of April, in other words, by tomorrow. A Ukrainian delegation has in fact been in Washington. They now say that there still remains an awful lot of work to do, and they can't say when this mineral rights extraction agreement is going to be agreed by, but it obviously won't be tomorrow. I don't think the Ukrainians have any intention to sign this mineral rights extraction agreement. Again, they've been stringing the Americans along, presumably in order to lure them to go ahead with the proposal set out in the draft document, which I've just been reading. Anyway, we're then told that Ukraine will be fully reconstructed and compensated financially, including through Russian sovereign assets that will remain frozen until Russia compensates damage to Ukraine. So Russia must pay reparations, and if it doesn't pay reparations, its frozen assets will be seized and will be handed over to Ukraine. And then we're told that US sanctions imposed on Russia since 2014 may be subject to gradual easing after a sustainable peace is achieved, and subject to the resumption in the event of a breach of the peace agreement. Now, notice this only refers to US sanctions. The Europeans make no commitment here to lift sanctions at all. There's no suggestion that the Europeans are ever going to lift sanctions. The document suggests that, well, even if Europe is not going to lift sanctions, not now, not ever, all of the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia will remain in place. Well, if the Americans want to relax some sanctions, that's up to them. At the moment there's any violations of the agreement, or at the moment there is some problem with the ceasefire, then the Americans are obliged to reinstate the sanctions that they have relaxed in full. Now, bear in mind what I said previously, with the structure of the proposal that we see here, that is almost inevitably going to happen. At some point or other, the Ukrainians will come round and say that there's been a breach of the ceasefire by the Russians. By that point, they will be rearming their military. They will have British and French troops and other troops from other NATO powers on their territory. They will have security guarantees from the United States. They will be able not only to get the Western powers to fight on their side, but they will also get the NATO powers, the Western powers, to reimpose, or at least the United States, to reimpose the full extent of its sanctions on Russia. The European sanctions, of course, never having been lifted. And there is no reason to think that in that event the sanctions would not remain in place permanently. Just saying. So this is the European-Ukrainian proposal, the one that was put to the Americans. It doesn't seem as if it has ever been put to the Russians. As I say again, this is an armistice agreement like the one the Western powers imposed on Germany on the 11th of November 1918. It is the kind of armistice agreement that is imposed by victorious powers upon a defeated power. This is what makes this entire proposal completely delusional. Obviously, the Russians are not going to accept a proposal of this kind. They would be insane if they did, and there is nothing about them to suggest that anybody in Moscow is insane in that sort of way. And the Europeans and the Ukrainians, and by the way the Americans too, if they ever endorse this proposal, would have no means to force the Russians to accept it. To repeat a point I had been making in program after program, the Russians are winning the war. Every day they advance, they take more territory, they destroy more Ukrainian forces. We'll come to that shortly in the program, later in the program. So this is an attempt through this document to treat the eventual winner of the war as a loser, and to make the loser of the war into a winner. And, well, one can just imagine how draconian the eventual peace agreement that came out of this process would be. As I said, this is an astonishing document in almost every respect. It reflects an almost deluded quality in European and Ukrainian decision making. Now, I come back to what I said. It's clear that this document has been discussed, under discussion for some time. Macron has been talking about it, has been clearly involved in drafting it, I should say. So of course, has Starmer. So have other European officials from the European Commission, from NATO. The Americans have been kept informed about it. Apparently, on the eve of the meeting in Paris, the one that took place on Tuesday, there was great optimism in Europe that the Americans were coming on side. Now, I find this incredible, but right across the British media, there are claims about this, that the Europeans assumed that when the Americans came, when Kellogg, Rubio, and Witkoff arrived, the basis for discussion would be this document. And they were stunned and blindsided when the Americans came up with something completely different. And the American document is completely different. And this is the document I'm going to come to. Now, to repeat again, it derives from the Kellogg plan, but it is not identical to the Kellogg plan. Alistair Crook on the Conflicts Forum has said that the American proposal is 95% Kellogg. I would, having looked at this, put it slightly lower than that, put it actually a bit lower than that. I'd say it's 80% Kellogg. But there have been important adjustments which take it significantly further than what Kellogg first proposed, as we shall see. So, this is what the proposal the Americans brought with them says. It was presented apparently to the Europeans and to the Ukrainians on Tuesday. The Europeans were stunned and horrified by it, and Zelensky had a public tantrum when he saw it. He assumed that his representatives, Yermak and the others, were going to discuss the ceasefire proposal, which the armistice proposal set up in the European draft. And suddenly he found, as the Ukrainians found, that they were being presented with a document like this. Anyway, this is the American draft. Russia-Ukraine deal framework. Transmit verbally. So you can see that it was provided in verbal discussions. Apparently the Americans did put it all down in a single sheet of paper, the key points. And anyway, we will now see what they are. The next thing is, we then read, overview. These terms represent the final offer from the United States to both sides. So this is an ultimatum. It is couched in language of an ultimatum to the Russians, but also, more importantly, to the Ukrainians and to the Europeans. And one can fully understand, again, the sense of shock that the Europeans and the Ukrainians must have had when they read it. This is the final offer. Anyway, this is what the draft goes on to say. Ceasefire, same title, ceasefire. Again, I'm sure this is all taken from the European draft. Ceasefire. And then it says permanent ceasefire, full stop. Nothing else. And then it goes on to say both sides immediately engage in technical implementation negotiations. Now, immediately you can see the difference from the Ukrainian-European draft, because both sides immediately engage in technical implementation negotiations. Those negotiations are to be bilateral between Ukraine and Russia, There is no reference here to the Americans and the Europeans participating. In the European draft, to go back to the European draft was both sides immediately entered into negotiations on technical implementation with the participation of the United States and European countries. So the Americans will not be involved, nor, importantly, will the Europeans be either. And then we move on to the question of security guarantees. And we're told Ukraine receives robust security guarantees. Guarantor states will be an ad hoc grouping of European states plus willing non-European states. The United States, however, is not mentioned. The United States is not giving Ukraine security guarantees. Again, if we go back to the European-Ukrainian draft, Ukraine receives robust security guarantees, including from the United States, Article 5-like agreement. So the Americans say, no, we are not giving Ukraine security guarantees. And then the American draft goes on to say this: Ukraine will not seek to join NATO. Now, this flatly contradicts the Ukrainian-European draft, which leaves open the possibility of NATO membership. It merely refers to the fact that for the moment there is no consensus among allies on NATO membership. Now, the European draft then spoke about the fact that there would be no restrictions on the Ukrainian defense forces. There is no reference to the Ukrainian defense forces in the American document, so it might be that there will be restrictions put in place at some time. And we're then told that there would be no restrictions on the presence, weapons and operations of friendly foreign forces on the territory of Ukraine. The American draft is silent on that question also. Now, the reason it is silent about these two things is obviously because the Americans know that the Russians would strongly object to both of them. So that is clearly another difference. The Russians say they will not agree to increases in the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. On the contrary, they want the Ukrainian armed forces significantly reduced. And the Russians, of course, have categorically ruled out the presence of troops from NATO countries on Ukrainian territory. So the Americans are silent on those questions. They're not ruling it out, but of course they're not actually ruling it in a way that, since this is an ultimatum presented not just to the Europeans and to the Ukrainians, but also to Russia, it would require the Russians to agree to things like that, things that, as we know, they would never agree to. And then we're told that Ukraine may pursue EU membership. Frankly, given what we read next, EU membership is all but inconceivable from this point onwards, because then we come to the question of territory. Now, the Ukrainian-European drafts make no reference to territory, other than the fact that the territorial negotiations start from on the basis of the line of control, but they clearly are aimed eventually at Ukraine regaining all of its territory, including Crimea, which is not mentioned in the Ukrainian-European draft. The American draft says this: territory. US provides de jure recognition of Russian control of Crimea. US provides de facto recognition of Russian control of Lugansk. US provides de facto recognition of Russian-controlled parts of Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Kherson. Now remember, this is an American proposal. What it says is that the United States recognizes formally, juridically, that Crimea is part of Russia. But it actually goes beyond that, because it also provides a measure of American recognition that Lugansk region is also under Russian control, part of Russia, and that those parts of Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Kherson are also under Russian control. Now, the point about that is that US recognition, in effect, makes it very difficult to see how Ukraine could take military action ever to regain these territories. Now, note again that this is an American draft. It is an American proposal put ultimately to Russia. It's presumably the draft that Witkoff has taken with him to Moscow, and which he is currently presenting to Vladimir Putin in Moscow. This document does not say that the Russians have limited their territorial claims in Ukraine to the territories in Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Kherson region, which they control. There was that article that appeared a couple of days ago in the Financial Times, which said that that Putin had told Witkoff at the previous meeting that the Russians were not seeking to recover the whole of the territory of the four regions. There's nothing in this document to suggest that. What this document says is that the Americans are making a take-it-or-leave-it offer to the Russians as well as to the others. If the Russians are content to accept that the territory that they will retain control of in Ukraine will be limited to those parts of Zaporozhye, Kherson, and Donetsk region that they currently control, then the United States will extend a measure of official, if not formal, recognition to that effect. Now, what the actual difference between de jure recognition and de facto recognition is, well, there's an awful lot of discussions about that. All kinds of international lawyers have all sorts of things to say. In my opinion, in practical terms, to the extent that we are talking about this particular document, it makes no difference at all. It's just that the Americans are recognizing that there is really no issue about Crimea being a part of Russia. They accept that there are separate territorial claims about Zaporozhye, Kherson, Donetsk, and Lugansk, but they recognize the rights of the party in control. Now, that would mean, for example, as I understand it, that American companies could operate in these four regions, those parts of those four regions, which are under Russian control, so that Visa and MasterCard, for example, could actually process transactions there. Just saying. So anyway, then we're told that Ukraine regains territory in Kharkiv region. We don't know precisely which territory, but let's assume that it's all of it. Then the next are the two parts of the European-Ukrainian proposal, which the Americans have taken up. They've adopted them into their plan. As I said, I think this is intended to soften the pill for the Ukrainians and the Europeans. So we're told that Ukraine regains control of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant through US control and administration of the plant, with electricity distributed to both sides, and also the Kakhovka dam. There is no way that the Russians will accept that. They've already rejected it outright, by the way. But I would add that this is, though it is close to being the same proposal that you see in the Ukrainian-European draft, it doesn't contain an important difference. So the Ukrainian-European draft speaks of Ukraine regains control of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant with US involvement, whereas the American draft says that Ukraine regains control of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant through US control and administration of the plant. So the plant is recognized as Ukrainian, but the United States operates it. And then we're told that the electricity generated by the plant will be distributed to both sides. So it takes a European-Ukrainian proposal, puts it in the agreement, the American proposal, but it does offer a significant gesture to the Russians as well. They would still receive electricity provided by the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Of course, this is all academic because the Russians would never agree to this. And then we're also told that Ukraine enjoys unhindered passage on the Dnieper River and control of the Kinburn Spit. The Kinburn Spit is a small part of Kherson region. It's the very, very far end of the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. The Ukrainians have made many attempts to recapture it from the Russians ever since the Russians gained control. The Russians have repelled successfully every one. And then we're told, and then it comes to economics. Again, the subtitle is taken from the Ukrainian-European draft. United States and Ukraine will implement economic cooperation minerals agreement. That's the same. Then, Ukraine to be fully reconstructed and compensated financially. But we're not told by whom. We're not told that it will be the Russians, and there is no reference here to the use of frozen Russian assets. And then we come to the part that must have made European as well as Ukrainian stomachs turn. Sanctions on Russia resulting from this conflict since 2014 will be removed. Now, that isn't just American sanctions. That is European sanctions also. And by the way, Japanese and South Korean sanctions. It would also mean that the Russians get their frozen assets back, the billions, hundreds of billions of dollars that belong to the Russian central bank, those would be returned as well. And there is, of course, no snapback. There's no snapback provisions in this. So if there's future breaches of this agreement, even if they're blamed on the Russians, well, that will not result in the sanctions against Russia being automatically reinstated. In fact, clearly, the United States has no intention of reimposing sanctions. And then we are told US-Russian economic cooperation on energy and other industrial sectors. So an economic partnership between Russia and the United States to follow. As I said, these two drafts are completely different from each other. Now, in an interview which Sergei Lavrov gave, that's the Russian foreign minister, gave to Face the Nation on CBS yesterday, of which, by the way, we have not had full details. Lavrov spoke warmly about Trump. He said he's the first Western politician who shows signs of addressing the root causes of the conflict, specifically NATO membership. And he said that there is, in fact, movement on a deal. Movement is heading in the right direction. We're not, however, there yet. There are still things to be agreed or fine-tuned, as he put it. And looking at this American draft, one can begin to see why. Now, this does address many of the Russian security concerns. As I said, there's no... This agreement does speak of Ukraine remaining outside NATO, for example. It also does recognize to a significant degree the actual realities on the ground, that Crimea is indeed Russian, that the territory that the Russians control in the 4 regions is essentially Russian as well. There are still issues which, going back to Putin's proposals of the 14th of June 2024, would still need to be resolved from a Russian point of view. To repeat again, the Russians have given no hint at any point that they are looking or intending to give up their claims to the remainder of the 4 regions. But the Russians have said that if they can achieve their objectives through peaceful negotiations, they will do so. Clearly, the Russians are telling themselves that they can achieve possession of the remainder of the 4 regions and protections for the rights of Russians and various other changes in Ukraine through negotiations as part of the negotiating process that would follow, that would be based on this framework agreement, despite the ceasefire that was in place. All, of course, based on the assumption that the Ukrainian military does not get rearmed or things of that kind. So I could see why the Russians might look at this and tell Witkoff, based on this proposal, yes, we can see that significant progress is being made. You're starting to move in our direction. We appreciate that. We might even, in light of this, be prepared to think about a ceasefire and move in that direction. Also, obviously, there's an awful lot that needs to be worked out if a ceasefire is to be effective. Yesterday, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman made a lengthy statement, public statement, in which she went through all the various breaches of all the various ceasefires that Ukraine has entered into and how it has never honoured any one of them, including the recent energy truce and Putin's Easter ceasefire. So there's clearly a lot of work to be done, and clearly now, having seen this American draft, that statement by the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman was made in anticipation of discussions that would take place, presumably with Witkoff today, about how the ceasefire might be implemented. There are lots of gaps, large ambiguities, lots of things that have not been agreed here and which still remain to be sorted out and discussed. But the Russians would say this is a step forward. It is an important step in the right direction. It does take us further towards peace. And, well, that then brings us back to the reaction of the Ukrainians and the Europeans. Now, as I said, the Ukrainians, having assumed that the European proposals, which, as I said, they've clearly worked on, were going to be the proposals that were going to be discussed, are obviously in shock, and they have rejected this American proposal outright. Now, it is important to say that they're not merely rejecting the Crimea provision in this proposal. They are rejecting the entirety of the proposal. They will not agree that they should not seek membership of NATO. They will not agree to American de facto recognition of Russian control of Lugansk and of the Russian-controlled regions in Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Kherson. As far as they're concerned, that is Ukrainian territory, or so they will insist. They're absolutely going to get it back. They understand that if the United States does confer even this sort of recognition to Russian control of this territory, then there is no prospect of Ukraine ever getting it back. And the idea that all the sanctions, American and European, would be lifted, and that the Russians and the Americans would move forward and engage in economic cooperation on energy and other industrial sectors. This is economic cooperation between two equal powers. It is completely different from the entirely lopsided and indeed extractive minerals agreement which the Americans are trying to force on Ukraine. Well, this must be profoundly shocking to them. And the fact that they're getting no guarantees from the United States, no promises of deployments of British and French troops, no promises that their military is going to be re-equipped, all of that must be horrifying also. But the Europeans must be shocked as well, because it's clear that they were starting to think and tell themselves that they'd managed to patch things together between the Ukrainians and the Americans after the February Oval Office row. They have clearly been telling themselves that American grumbling about the fact that the Russians had not agreed to the unconditional ceasefire was a sign again that the Americans were starting to tilt towards the Europeans. And now they find, to their shock, that the opposite is true, that the Americans actually have indeed been engaging in substantive negotiations with the Russians, and they're starting to make moves in the direction that the Russians want them to go. So, those horrified reactions that I spoke about yesterday, I expressed yesterday in my video my bafflement at the vehemence of the European reaction. Well, we can now see why. Because they thought they were on the brink of a major diplomatic victory. Of course, they cannot have believed that the Russians would ever agree to their proposal, but their assumption was that the Russians would reject the proposal and the Americans would blame the Russians for the failure of the negotiations, and then everything would then go back to where it was. Anyway, all of that suddenly is looking far less likely. And the tantrums and fits and the agonized wringing of hands that you see across Europe, the reasons for it are now becoming clear. Now, to repeat again, Zelensky has rejected this entire proposal outright. And the proposal is actually framed, if we go back to the original provision, these terms represent the final offer from the United States to both sides. So Zelensky has rejected an American ultimatum. He has done it in the strongest and indeed the most insulting language. And nonetheless, the Americans, for the moment at least, are still pressing on. They've taken this proposal presumably to Witkoff, so to Moscow with Witkoff. Witkoff is now, as I said, meeting with Putin. I'm sure the Russians have already seen the proposal. Unlike Zelensky, Putin will come back and say, look, there's things here which I can't agree with, but this does represent real progress. Very much the same thing as what Lavrov said in his interview to CBS. So it's likely to be another cordial meeting between Witkoff and Putin. Bloomberg is saying that Witkoff is going to try and get the Russians to agree that they should, to lift the restrictions, that the Russians should drop their demand that restrictions should be placed on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces and on its ability to re-equip. I am confident that Putin will reject that. He will say this is obviously something that cannot happen. He will make the point that that would just undermine the ceasefire and put the Russians in the position that they have always warned about, of negotiations being spun out indefinitely without the Ukrainians having any real incentive to come to a final settlement, because they would be in the process of rearming. It's the point Putin made when he spoke to Trump on the 18th of March, when Putin first proposed the unconditional ceasefire to him. And I can't imagine that Putin will have changed his stance on this. On the contrary, I would say that the fact that the Ukrainians would not be able to rearm during the period of the ceasefire would be for Putin an essential guarantee to ensure that if there was a ceasefire, the process of negotiations would go forward. But as I said, I could see that the Russians would feel that this is a step in the right direction. It's not the final agreement, but it is movement towards them. But we come back to the fundamental point. The Russians might be minded to work with this. The Ukrainians are not. And over the last few hours, ever since Zelensky spoke, they have been reiterating and arguing and complaining about the American proposal and saying time after time that they are not going to agree to any part of it. And European governments have scrambled to support them. So Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, now his reasons for going to for trying to speak with Trump administration officials are becoming clear. Mark Rutte is trying to lobby on the Ukrainians' behalf. He's presumably trying to get the Americans to go back on this final proposal of the United States and to return to the Ukrainian-European proposal. Starmer and Macron arguably are doing the same. All of European diplomacy is currently working. Diplomacy is the right word. Is trying to work to achieve that, to get the Americans to change their minds. But the mood across the European media is deeply pessimistic, and it looks as if they don't expect it to happen. So, given that the Ukrainians are rejecting this proposal, given that the Russians are saying that they're prepared to work with the proposal, or I'm sure will say that they're prepared to work with the proposal. It doesn't, as I said, fully satisfy them, but it's a step in the right direction. They're not going to reject it outright in the way that Zelensky and the Europeans are doing. Anyway, what is now going to happen? Now, to repeat again, we're told that this is a final offer from the United States to both sides. One is likely to give it some degree of conditional acceptance. The other has already given it outright rejection. The United States, Marco Rubio, Donald Trump, Colonel Kellogg, Steve Witkoff, have all said that if the proposal is rejected, then the United States is going to walk away. It's going to say enough's enough. It's going to pull out of the entire process of the negotiations and leave the Europeans and the Ukrainians and the Russians to sort it out between them. Is that what the United States is actually going to do? Well, we're beginning to get some suggestions that it might be. British military officers have been giving comments to the media that Ukraine is on the brink of running out of the weapons that it was supplied by the Biden administration in the last weeks that it was in office. And of course that takes us all the way back to a comment made by Kirill Budanov back in August, back a couple of months ago, that come midsummer, Ukraine's military position would begin to become desperate unless a peace agreement was achieved. In the meantime, without American weapons, Ukraine's ability to keep fighting is going to rapidly diminish. And of course, we know that the Russians are on the brink of a major offensive. The Europeans also are getting further suggestions from the Americans that they are in the process of withdrawing support. Bild Zeitung, the German newspaper, usually very well informed about politics in Germany itself, and Bild Zeitung has historic connections to what will soon be the ruling CDU party in Germany, the party of Friedrich Merz. It is saying that the United States is refusing to provide Germany with the data information that would be needed to make the Taurus missiles effective. So that probably explains why Merz is now reported as having second doubts about the supply of Taurus missiles to Ukraine, because effectively they're becoming unoperable. There are other reports that the United States is revising its stance. It's apparently it is no longer involved in investigating war crimes by the Russians. Notice that the American draft makes no reference to the return to Ukraine of Ukrainian children that the Russians have supposedly abducted, or civilian prisoners that the Russians have supposedly imprisoned. There's nothing about that in the American draft. And, well, it's difficult to read the American draft without getting a sense that at some point the Trump administration, Donald Trump himself, has aims or intends to lift sanctions on Russia in order to move forward with the economic cooperation on energy and other industrial sectors that the American draft is referring to. I'd be very interested to know, by the way, which industrial sectors this is supposed to refer to. Might it be aerospace? Just saying. Space exploration. The Russians have a very well worked out space exploration program with China, by the way. Might the Americans be looking or wanting to get a cut in? Who knows? But anyway, I do get the sense that this is ultimately where Donald Trump himself wants to go. But in the meantime, despite the fact that Zelensky and the Ukrainians have rejected these proposals outright and are not going to go back on them, there is another report, I believe it's also in Bild Zeitung, that the Ukrainians, it's also been reported in the British media, by the way, that the Ukrainians are now preparing themselves for the prospect of having to continue the war despite a complete cut-off of US intelligence and military supplies. So, despite all that, despite the fact that the Ukrainians are unlikely to change their stance, as I said, we see that for the moment at least, Trump is still talking about negotiating. And yesterday, he posted a comment on his Truth Social account, criticizing the Russians, criticizing Putin himself, for the missile strike on Kiev. Now, I should say this was the biggest missile strike I think that the Russians have conducted against Kiev since the start of the special military operation. When I did my program yesterday, I did not fully grasp the extent of it. The Russians, of course, as they always do, have not provided us with a huge amount of detail as to what it was exactly that happened and what the targets were. But there are reports that the Russians used up to 10 Kinzhal hypersonic missiles over the course of the attack, and that they also used ballistic missiles as well, and large numbers of ballistic missiles as well. Now, the Ukrainians, of course, are saying that these were North Korean ballistic missiles, and they're complaining that these missiles have become much more accurate. They might be North Korean ballistic missiles. I don't know. My guess is that they are more likely to be Russian-made Iskander missiles, but if they're North Korean, I won't be terribly surprised. Anyway, the point is that it does seem that these missiles did do a great deal of damage. Now, the Ukrainians are confirming that they were able, or claiming that they were able to shoot down around half of the Duranium drones that flew over Kiev. And can I just say, we've now had clarification about the nature of the Duranium drones. There's been lots of speculation about drones operating, Duranium-3 drones with jet engines operating in the skies over Ukraine. The latest word is that that isn't really true, that these are the standard Duranium-2 drones in terms at least of their engine, but that they're now flying at much higher altitudes and are now engaging in diving attacks on targets in order to evade Ukrainian air defenses, which are essentially heavy caliber machine guns. And that this enables these drones to operate much more effectively. Anyway, and that it's the dive attack that is creating the sounds, the new sounds that people are hearing. Anyway, the point is that the Ukrainians claim that they shot down around half the drones and a significant number of the air-launched cruise missiles, the KH-101s and the Calibres. But if you read Ukrainian reports, there is an immense amount of hand-wringing about the attack, even from Ukrainian officials, with admissions that the attack was basically unaffected by Kiev's air defenses, that most of the missiles got through and hit their targets, and that considerable damage was done. Now, there is a lot of rumor and speculation about what exact damage was done, and what I'm going to report now should be taken purely as a rumor. It is not confirmed, and it may not be true. But on the other hand, some of the reports do seem to be fairly well. Some of the sources that are reporting this claim do suggest that it might be true, and are fairly reliable sources. Anyway, reports are saying that several missiles fell upon and destroyed an important Ukrainian command bunker located beneath Kreshchatyk Street. Kreshchatyk is the major street in Kiev. It's Kiev's main street. It's the one the tourists see and visit mostly when they go to Kiev. And anyway, that these missiles crashed through and smashed through into the bunker, and that important command staff and personnel were killed in this bunker. And of course, and inevitably, and I want to stress again, this is not confirmed, there are even some suggestions that Western personnel were located inside this bunker and that they too were killed. Anyway, there has been profound shock about all of this. Anyway, the point is, Ukraine, very weakened position. What happens now? Does Trump take the Ukrainian no for an answer? The Ukrainians, despite all of this, all the things that we are seeing, the descent of the missiles, the fact that they're able to penetrate through Ukrainian air defenses, deal out this immense damage, the fact that the Russians continue to advance across the battlefronts. I'm not going to do a military update on this program, but I will say that it looks as if the village of Gornal in Kursk region is now mostly under Russian control, and that the Russians have made significant further advances, especially in the Konstantinovka area. But as I said, this is discussions for another day. Anyway, what do the Americans do? Do they actually walk away, as they've said? Are they intending to wash their hands of this affair? Witkoff has had a meeting with Dmitriev in Moscow prior to meeting Putin. The meeting that he's having with Putin in the Kremlin, Dmitriev and Ushakov will be there with Putin. There's been comments about the fact that Witkoff appears to be accompanied by only one American official. But the meetings with Dmitriev do point to a desire to get some kind of economic cooperation between the United States and Russia underway. Is that what Donald Trump intends to do? Was his complaint about the Russian attack on Kiev merely an attempt to give the impression that he's preserving balance? He said throughout the last couple of days that he's not on the Russian side, he's not on the Ukrainian side, he's just trying to stop the war, and that he's unhappy about missile strikes on Kiev because this isn't really helpful to stopping the war at the present time. Is it just that? Is it just an attempt to maintain balance? Or will Donald Trump reverse? Will he bend to the pressure that the Europeans, on behalf of the Ukrainians, and no doubt the neocons in Washington, are bringing to bear upon him? Will he row back on what he has already agreed with the Russians? Will he say, well, the conditional acceptance by the Russians of Witkoff's proposal is not enough, only a complete acceptance will do, and that the Ukrainians are clearly the victims of Russian aggression, And for that reason, the United States will go back and will continue to support them. Well, I don't know. And a lot will depend on what happens over the next couple of days. Now, Trump has also said that it is going to be in the next couple of days that the final decisions about how to end this war will be made. That might point to the 30th of April as the final cut-off point. That's 5 days from now. We shall see. But I don't expect the Russians to move from their positions. I certainly don't expect them to agree to a major upgrade of the Ukrainian armed forces. As I said, that would be completely illogical in terms of what they have been saying and arguing over the last couple of years and what has happened from their point of view over the course of the conflict. And I don't expect the Ukrainians to retreat from their outright rejection of the American proposal. So logically, that looks to be where we're heading. We're heading towards a situation where the Americans probably, within the next week or so, will make the decision finally to walk away. And since it will be the Ukrainians who will have rejected the proposal, it looks as if the Americans at some point will move forward and lift their own sanctions and begin the economic cooperation on energy and other industrial sectors that presumably Witkoff and Dmitriev are talking about. Now, as I said, nothing is ever certain. Nothing can be assumed until it's happened. Certainly not in a complex negotiation like this. But anyway, Reuters' publication of these two draft documents has provided a great deal of clarity about the situation that we're in today. I am going to make one rather bold prediction, which is that we are now definitely starting to enter the end game in the war. As I said, I don't expect the Ukrainians to shift their position. I don't believe that Zelensky is capable of shifting his position. As I said in my program yesterday, David Sachs, the American entrepreneur, who is now working in some respects for the administration, he said that Zelensky's outburst over Crimea, the easiest thing for him to concede, shows that he is basically not interested in peace, that he's not capable of engaging in negotiations. Donald Trump's son, Donald Trump Jr., reposted that comment of David Sachs with approval. Elon Musk has ridiculed Zelensky's latest claim that every dollar of aid provided by the United States to Ukraine can be accounted for. An absurd comment by Zelensky, by the way. And I wonder what on earth possessed him to say it. Zakharova, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman, has also said that all of the various violations of the ceasefire, of the various ceasefires that the Ukrainians have undertaken, and Zelensky's own stance and behavior shows that he is not somebody that can be negotiated with and who can be looked to make peace. So logically, the Americans, based on what they say, should walk away. And if they don't, and if the conflict continues, I can't believe that they will come back to the conflict with any degree of conviction. It won't be like Biden, Blinken, and Sullivan all over again. Since I brought up the mention of Sullivan, I ought to just say that he has apparently admitted in a recent interview that the ATACMS missiles that was supplied to Ukraine turned out to be a major disappointment, something I've been saying for months. Anyway, it's not going to be like them all over again. This American proposal paper shows how disillusioned with the conflict in Ukraine the Americans have now become. Even if the Europeans do somehow manage to pull the Americans back, the Americans are not going to come back with enthusiasm. They're going to become frustrated and irritated at various points. They're going to become more and more grudging about providing Ukraine with assistance. All of this at a time when Russian power on the battlefronts is waxing. Given that this is so, if the Americans walk away, the war will end more quickly. If the Americans don't walk away and continue to provide the Ukrainians with assistance, the war will continue rather longer. But the outcome, the eventual outcome, a Russian victory, will surely be the same. Anyway, that's the one prediction I'm going to make in this program up to this point. Always assuming, of course, that, as I said, something doesn't happen over the next 24 hours that reverses everything. The Russians say something that the Americans don't like. Something of that kind. Anyway, there we are. That's where we are with the conflict in Ukraine at this particular time. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about briefly is this murder of this Russian general on Russian territory. Now, this has clearly been prepared over a long time, so one can't say that the timing necessarily would have been connected to these ongoing negotiations. But the fact is that the authorities in Kiev must have known that the assassins who were working to assassinate this general were closing in on their target, and they nonetheless authorized the assassins to go ahead. They didn't try and countermand and call off the assassination at the last moment. In my opinion, that makes this yet another provocation of the sort that the Ukrainians have conducted many, many times. It's an attempt to provoke the Russians, to provoke Putin, Ushakov, and Dmitriev into saying to Witkoff, look, the people we're dealing with in Kiev are straightforwardly terrorists. There cannot be any negotiations with them. We can't obviously even debate peace proposals coming from you whilst they do these sort of things, causing the American-Russian negotiations to break down, which at this particular juncture would work to Ukraine's advantage. That, I think, is probably what this was all about. As I said, the plot will have been prepared well in advance, but the final decision to go ahead must have been made over the last few hours, or could have been countermanded over the last few hours, and that wasn't done. So anyway, I don't expect that this is going to shake the Russians from their course at all. Anybody who follows the way the Russian government works will know that. But perhaps, possibly, the Ukrainians don't. Anyway, Witkoff and Putin, as I said, are meeting. They've been meeting over the time that I have been making this program. Quite possibly, you will know more about this meeting than I do now, when I am making it. By the time it has been published, we might have some information about what has taken place. But anyway, this video is based on what I know at the moment, and there really isn't very much more I can say. Now, there's lots of other things going on in the world. We see the first tentative steps on the American-Chinese sides to de-escalate the tariff war. Donald Trump has talked about how the tariffs on China have reached, and the tariffs by China have reached unsustainable levels. And I expect that at some point over the next couple of days, we will be seeing some steps taken to bring the tariff war back under control. There is a very concerning outbreak of fighting between India and Pakistan, with all sorts of threats being made by each country against the other. But these important topics, very important topics, are ones that I'm going to have to leave until my next program. So this is where I finish today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.